Dear ladies and gentlemen, Szanowna Pani ta Panie, I would like to welcome all of you very warmly to our annual lecture at GWZO, named after Oskar-Halecki. Halecki was a historian of Central and Eastern Europe who contributed in the first half of the 20th century significantly to historiographical debates about the region. Halecki was a specialist in pre-modern history, but his expertise was reaching far beyond that. He contributed significantly to discussions about the possibilities and challenges of writing the history of a region. Our institute, the Leibniz Institute for the History and Culture of Eastern Europe, chose Halecki's name for our annual lectures for two reasons at least. Firstly, our institute is characterized by covering a wide chronological time span ranging from early medieval times until the present. And secondly, GWZO contributes since its beginnings to a self-reflective research about this region, our region. Comparative approaches and the constant questioning of the notion of the region Central and Eastern Europe are part and parcel of what we are doing here. To our annual lectures, we aim at inviting personalities whose academic oeuvre and/or political activities are crucial for our understanding of Central and Eastern Europe. Personalities who make an impact, whose contribution is special. It is therefore my honor to introduce to you our speaker of the 2022 annual lecture, Dr. Olesya Khromeychuk. Olesya Khromeychuk is a historian and a writer, and she became one of the most influential voices in Western Europe regarding the war on Ukraine, but also regarding Ukraine's position on European mental maps, be it politically, be it historiographically. She's a very sought-after interview partner for media in the English-speaking countries and publishes brilliant essays that explain the recent situation and its underlying historical currents. Among the most recent publication was one that warned about a Ukraine fatigue, about our societies getting used to pictures of war and the suffering, an effect that Putin factors into his calculations, so Khromeychuk. Our today's lecture is part of a lecture series on Ukraine, already the second term in a row. Our institute, GWZO, is cooperating here with other Leipzig-based institutions, the Chair of Eastern European History at the University of Leipzig, Professor Rodewald, the Chair of Slavonic Languages, Professor Anna Atwinska, the Simon Dubnow Institute for the Study of Jewish Culture, the Polish Cultural Institute, as well as the University Library. All these institutions try to speak loudly about Ukraine in present and past, and filling in the voids in public perception. On our poster, we quoted Olesya Khromeychuk's sober constatation, Ukraine, the largest country in Europe, yet it was mostly missing from our mental maps. We do agree about the missing knowledge about Ukraine, all of us who are teaching students, talking to neighbors, family, friends. But in German society, I would add, we observe a more dangerous phenomena than just a white spot on our mental maps. The void of concrete knowledge is sometimes, and not only sometimes, but far too often for our understanding, filled by propaganda narratives by Russia. And sometimes you hear in the German public even strange ideas about the way a peace has to be made. All the more we need the expertise on Ukraine. We need people who are able to explain in a way that addresses people's minds and hearts. Olesya Khromeychuk is, in my eyes, the person. She received a PhD from University College London and has taught the history of East Central Europe at the University of Cambridge, University College London, the University of East Anglia, and King's College London. Her PhD research was about Ukrainian post-war narratives of Waffen-SS Division Galicia, a highly controversial topic, and the PhD was published in 2013. She continued then to research Second World War with a project on the experiences of servicewomen in Russia and East Central Europe, funded by the prestigious Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellowship. And currently, she's the director of the Ukrainian Institute London. I encountered Olesya's work through her most recent book, published in 2021, entitled A Loss, the Story of a Dead Soldier Told by His Sister. In this book, one could simply and superficially summarize, Olesya tells the story of the death of her brother, who volunteered for the Ukrainian armed forces and was killed at the front line in 2017. In an ongoing war against Ukraine that Europe had already forgotten or never wanted to see. But the book is so much more. It is a deeply impressive reflection about loss, grief, about the profession of being an historian of war while experiencing war, the experience of migration, and the connection to the home country in times of war. And it is also, in my eyes, a very sharp analysis about Ukrainian society. It is intellectually and analytically on the point, applies historiographical artisanry to a complex topic, and it speaks from the heart. And it is beautifully written and an absolute must-read. Its publication history, one may add, is also a chiffre, I would say, regarding the war against Ukraine. Despite all its qualities, the book was first, if I understood correctly, only print on demand by IBIDEM, but then after Russia went full-scale war against Ukraine, it was reprinted by Monoray and can now find a broader audience, the audience it deserves. It was also translated into German, and I can just encourage you to listen to Olesya's voice beyond this very evening. Today, she is speaking about the very important topic of freedom in the conceptions of political thought in Ukraine. Before her lecture, we will listen to another important voice on the war against Ukraine. Andrii Rymlianskyi will read some poems by Sergei Chardin, the Ukrainian writer and singer who has just received the Friedenspreis des Deutschen Buchhandels. Andrii studied linguistics, German and English philology at the National University in Černivci, and later on interdisciplinary European studies at the University of Augsburg. He worked at Bukovina Institute that I was the head of for some years and started also a PhD with me, but his path took him into a different direction, now being a teacher and an integration facilitator and a very active person regarding humanitarian aid for Ukraine. He is the head of the Ukrainian club in Augsburg, where he coordinates the help since February 2022. Back in 2017, we hosted an impressive event in other circumstances, Serhii Žadan was present with us with his new book, Internat in Augsburg, the book on the war in Donbass, not yet being translated, and Andrii on this evening was the translator, and we had a reading, both of them were reading in the respective languages, Serhii Žadan in Ukrainian, Andrii in German, and it was just a very poetic moment. So today, Andrii will do both versions, the Ukrainian and the Germans, and he will say himself a few words about the poems he chose for this evening. And after Andrii, and already in the very beginning and in the very end, we will have the pleasure to listen to Ilona Smoljanchuk, who fled the war in February 2022, and she will play, as you've seen, the bandura and sing for us on this very special evening.
Guten Abend, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren. Vielen Dank, liebe Frau Röger, für die Einladung und für die Möglichkeit, heute dem Publikum das literarische Werk von Serhii Žadan etwas näher zu bringen. Serhii Žadan zählt unbestritten zu den wichtigsten Figuren und Stimmen der ukrainischen Gegenwartsliteratur und des aktuellen Krieges auch, weil er nicht nur ein Schriftsteller, Songwriter, Essayist, aber auch ein Volontär ist. Also er ist sehr aktiv und hilft bei vielen humanitären Aktionen auch und versorgt Zivilbevölkerung in der Ukraine in besonders betroffenen Gebieten und Städten. Für sein künstlerisches Werk und für seine humanitäre Haltung wurde Žadan mit mehreren internationalen Preisen ausgezeichnet, vor allem mit dem Friedenspreis des deutschen Buchhandels letztlich. Zu seinen jüngsten Arbeiten, Werken gehören der Roman Internat, das habe ich mitgebracht, und die Gedichtbände Antenne, Himmel über Kharkiv und Warum ich nicht im Netz bin, also die alle zusammen eine Art Kriegschronik seit 2014 darstellen. Selber der Roman Internat, der ist 2016 erschienen, ein Jahr später wurde er ins Deutsche übersetzt, ist in der Tat ein Meisterwerk, das die Unausweichlichkeit des Menschen mitten im Kriegsgeschehen und die Totalität des Krieges de facto dokumentiert. In seinem Roman schildert Žadan, wie sich auf einmal gewohnte Umgebung und gewöhnliche Lebensweise schlagartig eines Tages einfach verwandeln, in ein Kriegsfeld verwandeln. Und der Hauptheld im Roman Internat ist ein junger Lehrer, der vor dem Krieg gar kein Interesse am politischen oder gesellschaftlichen Leben hatte, der absolut apolitisch war, muss eines Tages mit der Realität des Krieges konfrontieren. Er muss seinen Neffen aus dem komplett zerbombten Internat, aus einer Schule, nach Hause holen, und Žadan beschreibt ihren Heimweg im Laufe eines Tages in einem radikalen und poetischen Ton. Also er zeigt und diskutiert unter anderem über die Fragen, ob man überhaupt im Krieg neutral bleiben kann. Für heute habe ich 3 Gedichte ausgewählt, und Serhii Žadan sagte einmal selber, in wenigen Versen kann man die Tragödie von Millionen Einzelner mittels dieser Gedichte näher bringen, also vermitteln. Ich lese erstmal auf Ukrainisch, und das erste Gedicht heißt Holka, die Nadel. Антон, 32 роки. В статусі було вказано, що живе з батьками, православний, хоча до церкви не ходив. Закінчив університет, іноземна, англійська. Працював татуювальником, мав свій почерк, ну, якщо можна так сказати. Через його вмілі руки і гостру голку пройшов не один натовп місцевих. Коли все почалось, багато говорив про політику та історію, почав ходити на мітинги, пересварився з друзями. Друзі ображались, клієнти зникли, боялись, не розуміли, виїжджали з міста. Найкраще відчуваєш людину, торкаючись її голкою. Голка жалить, голка зшиває. Під теплим металом таке податливе полотно жіночої шкіри і такий цупкий світлий брезент шкіри чоловіків. Протинаєш чиюсь оболонку, випускаєш з тіла оксамитові краплі крові. Б'єш, вибиваєш янголині крила на покірній поверхні світу. Б'єш, татуювальнику. Адже ми покликані наповнювати цей світ сенсом, наповнювати його кольорами. Б'єш татуювальнику цю обшивку, під якою душі й хвороби, те, чим ми живемо, те, заради чого вмираємо. Хтось розповів, що його підстрелили на блокпосту. Вранці, зі зброєю в руках. Якось незрозуміло. Ніхто нічого не встиг зрозуміти. Поховали в спільній могилі. Їх там всіх так ховали. Особисті речі передали батькам. Статус так ніхто й не правив. Пройде час, і яка-небудь наволоч обов'язково буде писати про це героїчні вірші. Прийде час, і яка-небудь наволоч скаже, що про це взагалі не треба було писати. Die Nadel, Anton, 32. In seinem Profil steht, lebt bei den Eltern, orthodox, aber kein Kirchgänger. Studienabschluss, Fremdsprachen, Englisch. Er arbeitete als Tätowierer mit eigener Handschrift, wenn man so sagen kann. Durch seine Hände unter seine Nadeln gingen die Einheimischen in Scharen. Als alles anfing, redete er viel über Politik und Geschichte, ging auf Demos, überwarf sich mit seinen Freunden. Die Freunde waren beleidigt, die Kunden blieben weg, hatten Angst, waren kopflos, zogen fort aus der Stadt. Am besten spürst du einen Menschen, wenn du die Nadel ansetzt. Die Nadel brennt, die Nadel heftet. Unter dem warmen Metall wird die Leinwand der Frauenhaut gefügig und das helle Segeltuch der Männerhaut straff. Du dringst in eine fremde Höhle, entziehst dem Körper samtene Blutstropfen. Du stichst und stanzt. Engelsflügel in die ergebene Außenhaut der Welt. Tätowierer, du stichst und stichst, denn wir sind berufen, die Welt mit Sinn, die Welt mit Farbe zu füllen. Du durchstichst die Ummantelung, Tätowierer, unter der die Seelen und Krankheiten liegen. Das, was uns leben lässt, das, wofür wir sterben. Jemand hat erzählt, man hätte ihn an einer Straßensperre erschossen, früh am Morgen, mit einer Waffe in der Hand, irgendwie aus Versehen. Keiner begriff, was passiert war. Er wurde anonym bestattet, wie alle anderen auch. Die persönlichen Dinge übergab man den Eltern. Sein Profil hat niemand geändert. Es kommt die Zeit, da wird irgendein Arsch Heldengeschichte darüber verfassen. Es kommt die Zeit, da wird irgendein Arsch sagen, darüber solle man überhaupt nicht schreiben. Das zweite Gedicht heißt Kaplan. Капелан Ігор, 30 років, але не голиться, щоб виглядати дорослішим. Всі хочуть виглядати дорослішими, серйозними, тим більше в 30. Вік, в якому можна легко загубитися, небезпечний вік, навіть для капелана. Дивно сповідувати чоловіків, які так уперто і послідовно порушують усі господні приписи, обпалюють шкіру об розпечений метал, опалюють губи тютюном, курять на вітрі, оглушені, розгнівані. Недопалки летять у мокру траву, хрестики, ікони, мастило під нігтями, вимикають телефони, йдуть до сповіді. Розповідають йому свої секрети, діляться бідами. Він би вже й не слухав би всього цього, але що має з цим робити? Кожен гріх ніби камінь з морського узбережжя. Розгнівані чоловіки, йому кладуть ці камені в долоню. Кожен свій теплий камінь, довго ношений в кишені. У нього вже повні торби цього каміння, він уже ледве волочить його за собою, а вони все приходять і приходять, приносять свої камені, передають йому, ніби щось найголовніше, постійно, вже скільки днів, докурюють, жартують, стають у чергу, бояться, що не встигнуть. Всі встигнуть, ніхто не запізниться. Igor, der Kaplan, 30. Er rasiert sich nicht, Erwachsener zu wirken. Jeder will Erwachsener wirken, gerade mit 30. Ein Alter, in dem man leicht abdriftet. Ein gefährliches Alter, selbst für einen Kaplan. Es ist merkwürdig, Männern die Beichte abzunehmen, die alle göttlichen Gebote so hartnäckig und konsequent übertreten. Sie versengen sich die Haut am glühenden Metall, verbrennen sich die Lippen am Tabak, rauchen im Wind, sind benommen und aufgebracht. Die Kippen landen im feuchten Gras. Kreuzkettchen, Heiligenbildchen, Schmieröl unter den Nägeln, sie schalten ihre Telefone ab und gehen zur Beichte. Sie erzählen dem Kaplan ihre Geheimnisse, reden über ihren Kummer. Er würde das alles lieber nicht mehr hören, aber was hilft's? Jede Sünde ist wie ein Stein vom Meeresufer. Die aufgebrachten Männer legen ihm die Steine in die Hand. Jeder gibt ihm seinen warmen Stein, den er lange mit sich herumgetragen hat. Ganze Taschen voller Steine hat er schon. Taschen, die er noch kaum fortschleppen kann. Aber sie kommen, die Männer, einer nach dem anderen, bringen ihre Steine. Geben sie ihm. Wie etwas ganz, ganz Gewichtiges. Ununterbrochen, seit vielen, vielen Tagen schon. Sie rauchen, witzeln, stellen sich in die Schlange, haben Angst, es nicht zu schaffen. Sie schaffen es alle. Keiner kommt zu spät. Візьми лише найважливіше, візьми листи. Візьми лише те, що зможеш сама нести. Візьми рушники та ікони, візьми срібні ножі. Візьми дерев'яні розп'яття, золочені муляжі. Візьми хліб і городину, потім іди. Ми ніколи більше не повернемося сюди. Ми ніколи більше не побачимо наші міста. Візьми листи, всі, до останнього злого листа. Нам ніколи не повернутись до наших нічних крамниць. Нам ніколи не пити з сухих криниць. Нам ніколи більше не бачити знайомих облич. Ми з тобою біженці. Нам з тобою бігти крізь ніч. Нам з тобою бігти вздовж соняшникових полів. Нам з тобою тікати від псів, спати поміж волів. Нам збирати воду в долоні, чекаючи в таборах. Дратувати драконів на бойових прапорах. Друзі не вернуться, і ти не прийдеш назад. Не буде задимлених кухонь, не буде звичних посад. Не буде сонного світла серед нічних осель. Не буде зелених долин і заміських пустель. Буде розмазане сонце за плацкартним вікном. Буде холевна яма, залита вапном. Буде криваве взуття на жіночих ногах. Вимучені вартові в прикордонних снігах. Підстрелений листоноша з порожнім мішком. Підвішений за ребро священник із безжурним смішком. Цвинтарна тиша, гамір комендатур. Списки загиблих, друковані, без коректур. Такі безкінечні, що навіть часу не стає шукати в них щоранку ім'я своє. Nimm die wichtigsten Dinge, die Briefe zum Beispiel. Nimm die leichten Sachen, die wiegen nicht viel. Nimm die heiligen Bilder, das Silberbesteck. Nimm die Kreuze, Goldkram, wir gehen weg. Nimm ein bisschen Gemüse und vom Brot ein Stück. Wir kommen nie wieder hierher zurück. Wir werden die Städte nicht wiedersehen. Nimm die Briefe, auch schlimme, dann lass uns gehen. Wir müssen die Nachtkioske verlassen. Die Gesichter der Freunde werden verblassen. Aus dem trockenen Brunnen ist kein Wasser zu ziehen. Wir sind zwei Flüchtlinge, nachts müssen wir fliehen. Wir laufen an Sonnenblumenfeldern vorbei. Wir flüchten vor Hunden, schlafen im Heu. Wir gieren nach Wasser, kampieren in Lagern und quälen die Drachen auf Truppenfahnen. Die Freunde sind fort, auch du bist verschwunden. Es fehlen die Stellen, die Küchenrunden. Nachts fällt in den Orten das schläfrige Licht. Grüne Teller und Brachen, es gibt sie nicht. Schmierige Sonne gibt's, die durchs Zugfenster dringt. die Cholera-Grube, zu der man Kalkpulver bringt, die Frauenfüße im blutigen Schuh, Wachposten im Grenzschnee kommen dazu. Ein verwundeter Briefträger mit leerem Sarg, ein Gehängter lächelnd im Priesterfrack. Friedhofsstile, Lärm auf Kommandaturen, Totenlisten, gedruckte, ohne Korrekturen. Namen endlos aneinandergereiht, den eigenen zu suchen ist keine Zeit.
First of all, let me say how truly grateful I am and absolutely privileged to address you at this year's Oskar-Halecki lecture. And I'm really, really grateful to Maren and Röger for inviting me and her wonderful team for welcoming me today so warmly, and for all of you for coming here tonight, for choosing to spend this evening with us. It's an absolute honor to talk about Ukraine at the moment, and it's absolutely vital that we continue to raise awareness about Russia's brutal war at the time when Putin continues to escalate it. And not just by terrorizing Ukrainian cities daily, but also by using energy blackmail and nuclear terrorism against Ukraine, but also against us here in the West and around the world. Much of the world's attention has been drawn to Ukrainian people's resilience in the face of Russia's full-scale invasion. And it seems to have come as a surprise to the international community, which to me served as evidence that little was known about Ukrainian history. The sort of history that has shaped Ukrainians into the political nation that we see today. Anti-imperialist, united, and defiant. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, and in fact for decades before that, Ukraine experts have been trying to explain to the world that Ukraine does have a very, very clear sense of self, and that Russia's instrumentalized history that denies Ukraine's existence is no more than a weapon of war. Vladimir Putin has treated the medieval Prince Volodymyr, who baptized the inhabitants of Rus as Christians, as if he were one of the present-day politicians sitting across the infamous long table in the Kremlin. Of course, if you know anything about the history of Rus, you will know that it was inhabited by Slavs and ruled by a group of Vikings, with a capital in Kiev long before Moscow existed. And you will also know just how absurd it is to use the historical narratives about the 9th century in order to justify Russia's contemporary warmongering. Similarly, if you are familiar with the history of the Ukrainian Zaporizhian Cossacks who inhabited the southern steppes of Ukraine in the 17th and 18th century, you will know that that region is key to Ukrainian identity, and Putin's attempts to annex it are doomed. And as if the use of history to justify a land grab wasn't enough, while Putin claims that that region belongs to some primordial Russia, his troops bomb its residents every day, occupy the largest nuclear plant in Europe, located near Zaporizhia, and risk bringing about a nuclear catastrophe even without resorting to nuclear weapons. But while we spend our time and energy on constantly debunking Russia's historical myths, we lose sight of the main problem. Even if Ukraine dropped from the sky in 1991, no one should have been allowed to violate its borders in 2014 and then again in 2022. For over 8 months, Ukrainians have been struggling to survive Russia's genocidal war. At the same time, they have been forced to continuously prove their existence as a nation. In this talk tonight, I am not going to prove that Ukraine has the right to exist. Ukraine does exist, and no one has the right to deny that existence. Instead, I will offer some snippets from Ukraine's recent history to demonstrate what historical experience has helped Ukrainians to stay resilient and keep fighting for freedom, and therefore for their future. And while speaking about history,
I will refer to my own experience of growing up in Ukraine. Because, as we all know, history we encounter in textbooks, first and foremost, is experienced by people like you and me. So, I was a very lucky child. My TV had only 3 channels, and half of the time even those needed encouragement to broadcast smoothly. But I had something much better than a TV, a window in our old flat. The view from my window opened onto a shabby square with a kitschy fountain, complete with disco lights and terrible music. Across the road from the fountain was a somewhat terrifying Soviet hotel. You can see a picture over there. It bore the name of the city in which it stood, my hometown, Lviv. But it looked nothing like the city itself. A concrete 8-story box with little uniform windows lined up in long rows. It was so out of place among the Austro-Hungarian tenements with their exquisitely decorated balconies and doorways. I grew up in one such tenement. The beautiful face of a woman with an unfurled head shawl adorned our entrance. And as a child, each time I pushed the heavy metal door open on my way home, I looked up at her face, hoping that I would be pretty like she was when I grew up. If you stood facing the beautiful woman about my door and turned your back to the shabby square with a fountain, the window immediately to your left would be that very window that was much better than a TV. I could sit on the windowsill together with my cat for hours and stare out. Not because I had a liking for disco lights or Soviet architecture. It was because between the square and the hotel, there was one of the main roads leading to the city center. That road that history walked. I could literally see history pass by my window. In the late 1980s, I watched crowds with red flags during Victory Day parades. They moved unenthusiastically past the Hotel Lviv towards Lenin Avenue, the central street in Lviv. Similarly to the hotel, that looked nothing like the city itself, that it was named after, the name of the leader of the Bolsheviks was totally foreign for an avenue that started with the famous Fadesiekle Habsburg Opera Theatre and ended with a monument to Adam Mickiewicz, a Polish romantic poet whose verse inspired anti-imperialist revolutions. Lenin Avenue had suffered through the years of Nazi occupation as Adolf Hitler Platz, but that was before my time. In the late 1980s, my cat and I watched Soviet tanks wheeled out to demonstrate the might of the military that was already crumbling, but like much else in the USSR pretended not to. Pass our house towards the Opera Theatre to then half-heartedly roll along Lenin Avenue. The annual ritual of celebrating victory over Nazism was in fact a way to reinforce communism in a country that kept trying to shake it off. I didn't join those parades. My parents were not members of the Communist Party and had no obligation to play the game of being good communists. They paid for it in reduced career prospects, but it was worth it. Not being a member of the Communist Party for them meant exercising relative freedom in a society mostly deprived of it. For me, this meant that I could watch this bit of history from the safety of our home. The next time history went past my window, I was able to join it. In 1991, my family and everyone we knew walked along the very road sandwiched between the fountain and the hotel on our way to the Opera Theatre. There were 2 major differences between this march and the Victory Day parades I had watched through the window. We were waving blue and yellow flags, and the avenue we were marching towards was no longer named after Lenin. It was now Svoboda Avenue. Svoboda in Ukrainian is freedom. Now tell me this, what is the archetypal image that springs to mind when you think of a Ukrainian? I say Ukrainian, you think what? Anyone? Go on. Don't be shy. Did someone say something? Including Ukrainians in this room. What are you thinking about?
Well,
Yeah, Cossacks. Okay, how did you guess? I heard different answers in different audiences, but yeah, Cossack is a guaranteed. A rowdy, flamboyantly dressed, mustached, and disheveled vagrant. Slightly scary, but mostly charming. A wild adventurer, a people's hero, a lovable rogue. This romantic view of the Cossacks has been cultivated for centuries. Ilya Repin's Zaporizhian Cossacks, Right to the Sultan of Turkey, depicts Ukrainian Cossacks penning a rude response to a demand from the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire to submit to his rule. The Cossacks, who don't have pipes in their mouths, are sporting a smug grin. Their eyes sparkle with rebelliousness and mischief. The episode depicted on Repin's canvas is most likely a legend. But legends can be more powerful than facts. The letter supposedly composed by the Cossacks is full of profanities and insults. It's an example of bad diplomacy. But it is also an example of insubordination to foreign rule. And that is what guaranteed the longevity of the legend. A version of Repin's painting could be found on the Maidan during the protests in 2013 and 2014. Ukrainian soldiers replicated it in photos from the front in the Donbass. While in 2021, Ukrainian MPs who had been sanctioned by Russia posed for a photo in the parliament dressed in Cossack outfits, referencing Repin's composition. The difference was that, unlike in Repin's painting, there was a woman and a Crimean Tatar among the MPs. And the letter, of course, was not addressed to the Sultan, it was addressed to Putin. History is full of examples of Ukrainian defiance in the face of foreign imperialist oppression. It is romanticized and passed on through art, literature, and oral history. My own great-grandfather taught me to sing. His favorite song was about a freedom-loving Cossack who wouldn't be constrained even by love. I leapt up the songs and the legends about these freedom-loving Ukrainian rebels, but more formative was my great-granddad's own life, deprived of romanticism and idealization. He witnessed the violent 20th century with his own eyes. His father left at the turn of the century for North America, never to be heard of again. And my great-grandfather, then a boy himself, became responsible for his siblings during the First World War. During the Second World War, he was looking after his own family. He lived in at least 4 different states without leaving his native village. Occupations, wars, change of borders and regimes meant that he was born in the Habsburg Empire, spent his youth in Poland, witnessed Soviet and Nazi occupations as a grown man, and saw the beginning of the end of the USSR in his old age. He didn't live to see independent Ukraine, but he could sense the freedom in the air as he taught me to sing about Cossacks. Throughout his life, a village man with basic education, he kept himself informed about the numerous political groupings running wild in his village and the wider region, but joined none of them. He never warmed up to the Soviets, even though he had served in the Red Army during the Second World War, perhaps because he served in the Red Army. In the 1980s, he was surprised that my mother, his granddaughter, could do business for the Poles. "These people sacked me just because I spoke Ukrainian," he would remind her frequently. He had a very clear sense of self. The sense of self might have been reinforced by the stuff of legends, but it was rooted in daily choices he had to make in his life that stretched nearly the whole of the 20th century. Freedom for him was imperative for survival. What I'm trying to demonstrate with this example is that attempts of foreign subjugation of Ukraine cultivated resentment of foreign rule and distrust of authorities, and the sense of self for which independence and freedom were vital. So we established that Ukraine did not appear in 1991. Ukrainian statehood was restored in 1991, but a nation can exist without a state. In 1995, Mark van Hagen wrote an article with a provocative title, "Does Ukraine have a history?" Van Hagen openly states that if we leave Ukraine and look at the political geography of history teaching, we find virtually no recognition that Ukraine has a history. He explained this overlooking of the largest state within Europe thus: because none of the states which exist today between Berlin and Moscow existed at the time of the rise of modern historiography in the early and mid-19th century. Their histories continue to carry a tint of artificiality, non-genuineness. Real states are Britain, France, Spain, Russia, and with qualifications, Germany. But Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and especially Ukraine are suspect candidates in the international order and somehow undeserving of the prerogatives of genuine statehood. Fast forward 3 decades, this denial of historiographical legitimacy is still widespread in the Western world, both inside and outside of academia. And it has, indirectly, prepared fertile ground for Putin's denial of Ukraine's historical legitimacy, both in rhetoric and in action. A young aspiring historian writing about Ukraine's experience in the Second World War, I was told by my senior colleagues to expand my analysis to proper nations, in particular Russia. But I want to study Ukraine, I replied, honestly, if naively. Study Ukraine by all means, but choose another more serious case study, or else you won't get a job, they replied. And they were right. I passed my PhD, my monograph was published and well received, but I didn't get a job teaching Ukraine. I was stuck in endless teaching of proper history, that of the empires that ruled everything between Berlin and Vladivostok. If Ukraine featured in these modules that I was asked to teach, it was often an afterthought. In one of my classes on the history of East Central Europe, I got my students to draw a line around Europe as they imagined it. The vast majority of them drew the easternmost border down the Dnipro River. My students would not be the first to cut the sovereign state in half. Political maps in rooms with much more geopolitical impact than a university classroom disregarded Ukraine's statehood aspirations more than once. Historically, the role Ukraine played in Western and in particular old Europe's imagination has been that of a buffer zone. This has led to it being turned into a war zone on several occasions in the past. When the empires collapsed in the aftermath of the First World War, the Allies chose to support stronger Poland, restored after 123 years of partitioning by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, to protect themselves against the violence of the Bolsheviks. The lands populated by Ukrainians were treated as a buffer zone necessary for the safety of proper Europe. In the aftermath of the First World War, in theory, everyone had the right to self-determination. But in practice, it turned out that some had more rights than others. Just before the Ukrainian lands were split between primarily Poland and the USSR, they had briefly come together into one state. The newly formed Western Ukrainian People's Republic, encompassing the territory formerly under Habsburg rule, merged with Ukrainian People's Republic, comprising the lands that were under the rule of the Romanovs. The Unification Act was signed on the 22nd of January 1919. Soon after, the Bolsheviks defeated the fledgling state. But the vision of Ukrainians united into one polity remained. 71 years to the day since that unification, I got to experience Ukraine's unity firsthand as a 7-year-old. In 1990, my parents took me to the center of Lviv to participate in a human chain uniting Kyiv and Lviv, in remembrance of past statehood and in hope for the future. Standing there, holding my mother's hand on one side and a stranger's hand on another, I imagined the spark traveling through the clenched fists for hundreds of kilometers. It passed through cities like mine, through villages like those where my mom and dad came from. Through the motorways, we traveled in my father's car, exploring Ukraine, and into the grand city of Kyiv, a city that at the time I didn't love as much as I loved Lviv, but which I came to respect as a capital of my country. My country was being willed into existence by people who held on to the vision of their nation's independence as strongly as they held on to each other in that human chain. If Ukraine has a future, then Ukraine will have a history. Van Hagen quotes a Ukrainian scholar's response to his question in the paper that he wrote in 1995. It is a vision of the future that has seen Ukrainians through the years of statelessness. To mark the anniversary of the Act of Unity in January 2022, people took to the streets to form a human chain again. The country was encircled by Russian troops ready to attack. The centuries of statelessness and 3 decades of statehood made the vision of the future crystal clear for Ukrainians. It was also clear that that future was worth defending. What I am stressing here is that the conditions of statelessness of Ukrainians should not be perceived as a weakness that makes a nation non-historical and thus of lesser significance on the world stage, but rather as an experience that made Ukrainians think of themselves as a collective whose identity was defined by opposition to external and oppressive political rule. On the TV, that only had 3 working channels, on the 24th of August 1991, I watched history being made. The parliament proclaimed the independence of Ukraine. I watched the blue and yellow flag brought into the large room of the parliament by overly excited people's deputies. I watched grown men, and the vast majority of the parliamentarians were men in the best traditions of Soviet gender equality, cry like children. I was a child. I didn't cry. I didn't fully understand what had just happened, but I knew it was big. A few months later, on the 1st of December 1991, the citizens were asked to confirm if they supported the Declaration of Independence in the referendum. Their answer was an unequivocal yes. 92% supported the declaration made by the parliamentarians in August. Just under 30 million voted their country into independence. The future the Ukrainians saw for themselves consigned the USSR to the past. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics collapsed a week later. I remember going with my parents to vote in the referendum. We were all dressed in our finest traditional embroidery. As a 7-year-old, I felt terribly important, as if I had been given a vote too. How do you remember the day of the referendum? I asked my father, who has been living in London since the late 1990s. I asked this in a short break between discussing the distressing news of Russia's current war in Ukraine. I remember getting really drunk with my workmates, my father says. We went to the demo and then we got absolutely wasted. The entire nation was drunk with excitement. No more statelessness. No more foreign rule. No more repression. Ukraine was free. The hangover was painful. The sobering up quick. The 1990s were the years of poverty, hardship, and unemployment. The rule of law was replaced by the rule of organized crime. The people of Ukraine kept trying to make their voices heard. Workers' strikes became a regular occurrence. But as the vast majority of citizens became poorer and poorer, a small minority grew richer and richer. These were the challenges that came with the acquisition of freedom. In the context of economic deprivation, abuse of authority, people made different choices in order to survive. Many, like my family, left the country, unable to fight corruption and unemployment. Loving Ukraine from afar turned out to be tough. In the UK, where my family settled after leaving Ukraine, I felt exoticized by the locals and misunderstood by my own people. Most locals didn't have a clue where Ukraine was, and the knowledge of those who did was limited to Chernobyl and Shevchenko. Not the 19th century romantic poet, the founder of the nation, Taras Shevchenko, but Andrii Shevchenko, a footballer popular at the time. The Ukrainian diaspora in the UK, most of whom were descended from people who had come after the Second World War, didn't really understand why people like my family had left. We had to run away from the war and the communist yoke. You ran away from freedom. You abandoned your independent state, some of them said. I tried to explain that we might have been free from communism, but we were not free from the legacy of corruption it left behind. I tried to explain that independence on paper means little when it cannot be put in practice. I tried, and then I gave up. I grew tired of educating everyone I met, from students or lecturers at my university to customers in a pub where I worked after the lecture, that no, Ukraine is not part of Russia, and yes, we do have our own language. I resented being Ukrainian, I hid my Ukrainianness, I altered it, but then I realized that I was free to create my own vision of Ukraine, even if it didn't resemble the reality at the time. My leaving the state did not mean exiting the nation. My leaving Ukraine meant that I joined that portion of the nation that lived beyond the political borders of the state. Ukraine was becoming a diaspora nation, and I chose to be part of it. As I was grappling with my identity, Ukraine was grappling with hers. Abuse of power by the authorities was testing Ukrainians' patience to limits. Writing in the late 1970s, Václav Havel argued that people contain within themselves, I'm quoting, the power to remedy their own powerlessness. In his The Power of the Powerless, he stressed that power is only effective in as much as citizens are willing to submit to it, and a citizen who yearns for freedom and dignity cannot be fully repressed. More performance, I guess. His view was that individuals can choose to live within truth, even when the authorities force them to live within the lie. In the 2000s, Ukrainians had a choice: to go back to the Soviet-style inertia of accepting their life within the lie, in which the oligarchy was presented as a version of democracy, or not. The students who had defended Ukraine's right to independence in the early 1990s, including by going on hunger strikes, were now in their 30s. My own generation, which remembered the referendum of 1991, had come of age in early 2000s and was ready to take to the streets to protect their right to live within the truth. The 2004 presidential election proved to be a perfect storm. And thus came about the Orange Revolution. Having just turned 21, I decided that I was grown up enough to take part in my country's political life. So I hopped on a plane and joined one of the groups of international observers from Britain. On the bus, taking us from Kyiv to Izmail in the Odessa region, where we were sent to observe the runoff of elections, I listened to Vera Rich, a British translator of Ukrainian and Belarusian literature, recite poetry of Ukrainian classics in her rendition. The lines from Shevchenko, not the footballer, the romantic poet, translated by Vera Rich, no longer seemed overly romantic. They began to acquire a very real meaning. Struggle on and be triumphant. God himself will aid you. At your sides fight truth and glory, right and holy freedom. The Orange Revolution ended in what seemed like a victory for democracy. The transition of power was peaceful. Living within the truth, however, continued to be a struggle in Ukraine. The Maidan protests of 2013-2014 had at least one character left over from the Orange Revolution. Viktor Yanukovych made a comeback in 2010 in the presidential elections. Yanukovych's awkward balancing act between the EU and Russia fell through in November 2013 when he refused to sign the association agreement with the European Union and tightened connections with Russia instead. Now, there's a degree of tolerance in the Ukrainian society of self-interested politicians. When their actions reach the limits of societal tolerance, the citizens know the drill. They take to the streets. In the first phase of the protests, the protesters were mostly students, those who had been school kids during the Orange Revolution. This was a generation that had been born in an independent Ukraine. It had no personal memory of the USSR. It knew Europe not as some mysterious place of dreams, but as somewhere you go on a student exchange. This generation knew freedom intimately. The peaceful protests turned violent when the riot police brutally dispersed the young demonstrators. Rather than responding with violence with fear, Ukrainians, now including those who took part in the protests in the 1990s and 2004, flooded the squares not only in Kyiv, but all over the country. The next wave of violence came when the riot police began to shoot at unarmed protesters, killing more than 100. The protests turned into a war against authoritarianism. The citizens were not prepared to give ground, and eventually Yanukovych was forced to flee. When I arrived in Kyiv to interview the women who had taken part in the Maidan, to include their stories in a piece that I was writing at the time, the barricades were still intact in the center of Kyiv. The fires that kept the protesters warm were still smoldering. The crosses marking the spots where civilians were shot were new. The city looked like a war had just finished, when, in fact, the war was just beginning. The Maidan was a turning point. It showed the ability of Ukrainians to stand united in times of crisis, even if their political, social, and ideological positions varied radically. It demonstrated that people could not only make their voices heard, but actually make a difference. The protest came to be known as a revolution of dignity. The price for this dignity was high, and it was imperative that this time the change would be lasting. A country that set out to reform itself, to reload, as one of the protest signs put it, was a country that threatened the old order across the border in Russia. Putin's response to the ousting of the Ukrainian president he worked so hard to control was the occupation of Crimea and the invasion of eastern Ukraine. The reaction of the international community was mostly limited to declarations of concern and the continuation of business as usual, including purchasing oil and gas, which normalized and funded Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Unsurprisingly, this emboldened Putin to keep destabilizing Ukraine through violence. Both Crimea and Donbass became sad examples of the Russian world that Putin set out to create, a world where ordinary citizens could be abducted, tortured, and jailed if they showed any disagreement with the occupying forces. Many of those who stood on the Maidan went to the front line as either soldiers or volunteers. We didn't sing "Soul and body will lay down all for our freedom for nothing," one of them told me, quoting a line from the Ukrainian anthem that was frequently sung by the protesters. It's not just words for us, we mean it. They meant it. Even those who had never visited the Donbass before the invasion were eager to fight for eastern Ukraine in order to defend their country's territorial integrity. My brother, Volodya, was one of them. He joined the Ukrainian armed forces in 2015. He took a bit of time to make the decision, waiting for a draft. The draft never came, so he volunteered instead. In 2017, my brother was killed in action in the Luhansk region. He was fighting against the Russian army, which pretended not to be there, while the world pretended to believe it. When he was killed, the same phrase kept coming up when his comrades spoke of him. They called him a free man. When composing the text for his gravestone, before listing his roles in the army, I wrote the following line: a brave warrior, a native of Lviv, an artist, a free man. Just before my brother returned to the front line after his first deployment, he told me that I was naive to think that the war in eastern Ukraine would be contained to that area, or indeed to Ukraine. It's a European war that happened to start in eastern Ukraine, he said. I didn't pay much attention to those words at the time, but I remembered them frequently when Putin staged the full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022. The brutal shelling of civilians caused millions of Ukrainians to flood into EU states seeking safety. Eastern Europe was coming into Europe proper, not thanks to political agreements, but thanks to Russian aggression. When my brother died, the state gave us a small flat in Lviv as a form of support for a family that had lost a relative in the war. The flat is nothing like the old tenement building with a window that opened onto history. It's located in a converted 1950s Soviet block, built as a hostel for workers. In fact, when it was built, The rooms that now make up the flat were used as red corner, the mandatory room in Soviet institutions filled with Soviet propaganda literature and decorated with a dusty red banner. When in 2022 the attack by the Russian troops pushed Ukrainians from east and south to the western regions of the country, we offered our flat to internally displaced people. At one point it housed 7 people, a dog and a cat. When I visited it a month ago, I met the family that resides there now. 4 generations of women from southeastern Ukraine, from Zaporizhzhia region. The youngest is 4. The oldest is in her 70s. East and West united in a flat that was given to a family of a soldier fallen in the war against oppression. A free man, now dead, was hosting free people from different parts of his free country. When Russia started its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there were many from Berlin to Washington who didn't trust Ukraine to hold its ground for more than a few days. They overestimated Russia's strength and underestimated Ukraine's resilience. That disbelief in the determination and unity of the Ukrainian people meant that much-needed weapons and other aid arrived late, and that more military and civilians were killed by the invading troops than would have been the case had the necessary provisions been supplied in advance, or at least promptly. At least part of the reason why the military, political, and financial support was slow before the escalation at the start of the full-scale invasion and continues to be hesitant, at least in some countries today, lies in misunderstanding of Ukraine as a state and as a nation, and in misunderstanding of the brutality that Russia is capable of. Trusting Ukrainians with their experience of the past, their defense of the present, and their vision of the future is absolutely vital for the survival of Ukraine. But this trust is based on knowledge. To acquire that knowledge, we need to learn not just what Ukraine is not, in other words, that it's not like Russia, we need to learn what Ukraine actually is. We need to stop thinking of it as a buffer zone between our comfort and Russia's threat to disturb it. Because if it doesn't stop being a buffer zone on our mental maps, it will continue being a war zone. If we are to truly change the way we understand Russia's war in Ukraine, we need to admit a lack of understanding on our part of what Russia actually is. What it actually is rather than what we've imagined or wished it to be based on the 19th century classics we've read about war and peace or crime and punishment. Also, if we have learned anything from the past 8 months, and from not initially trusting Ukrainians with their own country, it is that we must listen to what Ukrainians say about how they see peace. For Ukrainians, there will be no peace while any part of Ukraine's territory continues to be occupied. Because occupation means persecution, torture, abductions, and killings of Ukrainian citizens. Tolerating it gives the green light to the aggressor to keep going. For Ukrainians, there will be no lasting peace without justice. And justice means holding to account the perpetrators of war crimes of all calibers, and not concerning ourselves with how to allow the main war criminal to save face. The democratic world is learning many lessons from the Ukrainian experience of fighting for freedom. A key lesson, in my view, is that freedom is fragile. Those who know its price are willing to fight for it. And I would strongly encourage us here, in Leipzig, in London, in New York, in Paris, in Berlin, and elsewhere, to ask ourselves the question that people all over Ukraine have already answered. What price for freedom are we prepared to pay? And do we have a vision of our future that is worth fighting for? Thank you so much.